Putin made the threats. The Baltic states are in Russia's sights as Putin rages about drones and NATO prepares for a future fight with Russia. Latvia is preparing. To defend itself against Russia, Latvia is erecting dragon's teeth all over its border. The jaws of the dragon are ready to snap shut. Putin's land forces aren't prepared for what the Baltic has in store for them. But it gets worse for Russia's leader. NATO is doing something even more massive on the Baltic borders that sends a clear message to Putin. Whatever you plan to do next, NATO is ready for you. Concrete is the counter to everything that Putin has in store. At least that's Latvia's approach, as it's erected dragon's teeth across its borders to serve as a dangerous anti-tank barrier to Russia's forces. These fortifications have become part of the much larger Baltic Defense Line that the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia agreed to erect, and the heavy row of pyramid-shaped dragon's teeth exist to show that Russia can't achieve the sort of fast breakthrough on the ground that would allow for a fast invasion of the Baltic territories. Latvia's LSM has the breakdown, as it notes that the dragon's teeth have been set up on land that Latvia's government expropriated for national defense purposes. Construction on the teeth began back in 2024, though the first rows of them weren't installed until a year later. Fast forward to May 28th, there are now dozens of dragon's teeth on Latvia's border, each arranged in 3 rows that stretch about 10 meters wide, with the gaps between them being so small that military vehicles from tanks to armored cars aren't able to drive between them. Latvia has been planning this for a while. The land that it expropriated hasn't just been snatched from its owners. A special commission has been created with the sole job of determining how much compensation those landowners will receive for handing over their property in defense of their nation. This is solidarity in action, the recognition that Russia presents a huge problem that needs to be solved. And as the head of the Narva Border Center, Antti Ensalu, points out, these new defenses are absolutely necessary. Speaking about Estonia's decision to do something similar in 2025, Ensalu said, "This is primarily necessary to improve border crossing security. About 5 years ago we had an incident where a vehicle from the Russian side breached the existing barriers. Installing barriers will help prevent unauthorized passage. Installing gates will also help better manage the situation on the bridge, for example, in the event of an influx of migrants. So these are all multi-purpose defenses. Plus, as we've just hinted, Latvia is far from the only Baltic state to erect concrete barriers along its borders. Latvia's new dragon's teeth join those that have been set up by both Estonia and Lithuania." Ensalu's comments were made back in August 2025, as Estonia engaged in a campaign to build gates and barriers across the Narva Bridge that connects Estonia to Russia. That bridge will be the main route that Putin's ground forces have to take if they want to cross the Narva River to pile into Estonia. And the defenses ensure that Estonia is able to completely control the flow of traffic into its country. Right now, that means stopping migrants that Russia is sending in their tracks. But in future, Estonia believes that these defenses could prove pivotal in stopping Russia's forces long enough for a NATO response to come and sweep Putin's marauding forces away. Lithuania did something similar, also in August 2025. That month saw the Baltic state complete the installation of dragon's teeth along its border with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. The commander of the Lithuanian army, Raimundas Vaikšnoras, explained the move at the time, stating, "We are starting from the tactical level, specific obstacles on the border, and later we combine the entire engineering plan into one conceptual system. Translation, the Baltic states are getting ready for a Russian attack from all sides." The dragon's teeth being erected now are just the first part of a wider cooperative defense plan designed to protect all 3 Baltic nations against Russia. Putin will be watching anxiously as he sees the Baltic states preparing for what he has planned. But there is something else that NATO has in store that will take Russia's leader from feeling anxious to leaving brown stains in his pants. Before we get to that, there's the issue of what Latvia's latest move means in the wider context of its defenses. Dragon's teeth aren't just for show. They're part of the Baltic Defense Line we mentioned earlier, which the Liebe Institute at West Point has labeled as a military necessity as Russia pushes its luck and pushes buttons with NATO. The Institute says that what's happening on NATO's eastern flank is part of the most strategically calibrated defensive preparations since the Cold War, as the dragon's teeth that the Baltic states have built will be combined with a series of bunkers, trenches, surveillance systems and observation posts, all working in concert with a singular goal: delay Russia to buy time for Article 5 to be triggered so that NATO can send troops. The Baltic Defense Line amounts to a trio of layers, beginning with the types of anti-vehicle barriers that Latvia has just erected. They stop Russian tanks and armored vehicles in their tracks. and once stopped, those vehicles end up in the firing lines of anti-armor defenses that destroy them. Another layer of defense ends up being added with each Russian tank that burns. Each becomes a barrier in its own right, making it even harder for Putin's forces to break through. Speaking of fire, the second layer of the Baltic Defense Line combines a series of infantry bunkers and a trench system with command posts designed to coordinate the Baltic defense. Bunkers provide the perfect place from which to fire on the enemy, while trenches can also slow Russian armor down and create a nightmare for Putin's soldiers as they try to break through the Baltic borders on foot. And right at the rear of the line is the third layer of defenses, which combines ground sensors, observation towers, and reconnaissance drones that feed real-time data to NATO, allowing the collective defense organization to formulate an appropriate response. None of this is being done by accident. There is nothing haphazard about what Latvia and the other Baltic states are doing. In fact, every defensive measure being put in place today has been carefully planned and is a result of joint NATO operations that began long before Putin invaded Ukraine. Returning to the Dragon's Teeth, nobody is under any illusions that they alone can stop Russia's forces. That's not the point. The concrete contraptions aren't some new inventions that Russia's military planners have never seen before. They've actually been around since World War II, to the point where they were once seen as somewhat outdated when it comes to modern warfare. But then that description can also be applied to the military tactics that Putin has been employing in Ukraine. Russia's strategy is to force through a victory using an approach that is almost a century old. Tanks still play a huge role in how Russia fights, as does sending cannon fodder on foot that exists to absorb ammunition in order to wear down an opponent. If Russia is going to fight like it's still the 1940s, Latvia and the other Baltic states are going to erect defenses designed to deal with that approach. Tanks have to be stopped. Dragon's teeth are one of the best ways of keeping Russia's increasingly aging metal monstrosities at bay. And when combined with carefully placed minefields, which the national interest implies is part of the Lithuanian aspect of the Baltic Defense Line, and may well end up being implemented across other Baltic borders, Dragon's Teeth can be one of the most important defensive assets for dealing with the 21st century Russian military that doesn't seem to have progressed from the glory days of World War II. However, there's a stark reality that Putin has to face. Dragon's Teeth and border fortifications across the Baltic borders aren't the only things that are going to be lying in wait for the Russian forces if they ever attack. NATO has something much more dangerous in mind, a response so lethal that it will force Putin to rethink his entire Baltic strategy. That new response is a game changer on the Eastern Line. But before we dig into that, if this is the kind of insight you want to see, make sure you are subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. So the dragon has been unleashed. But as the dragon's jaws clamp shut on Putin's armor, Russia will have a lot more to worry about than the Baltic Defense Line. NATO troops are coming to the Baltic states in what may be the biggest sign yet that NATO is getting ready for war with Russia. Toward the end of May, Reuters broke the news that NATO is preparing to strengthen the eastern flank by assigning another army corps to the Baltic region. This isn't any old corps, it's the German Netherlands Corps, which was stationed in the western German region of Münster, but is now on its way to Estonia and Latvia to serve as a new layer in the defensive structure that NATO is building up to deter Putin. The German Netherlands Corps amounts to a serious military response to Putin's plans. Around 1,100 personnel serve in the corps itself, which may not seem like a lot, especially when accounting for Russia's cannon fodder strategy. However, the corps is less about the amount of manpower it brings to the table and far more about the role it plays in organizing troops to deal with a threat. During an emergency, such as Russian forces attempting to cross into the Baltic states, the German Netherlands Corps can have up to 100,000 soldiers placed under its command. NATO hasn't sent a minor force here. It's sent an army corps capable of coordinating the sort of response that can send Putin's patsies packing. What this all means is that NATO is preparing to completely transform the way it organizes the eastern flank. Right now, NATO forces that are stationed in the Baltic states and northern Poland fall under the command of the Multinational Corps Northeast, which is stationed in Szczecin, Poland. That corps isn't going anywhere. It's existed in Poland ever since the nation became a NATO member, and it's a huge part of the command structure that NATO has created for the Baltic region, Estonian World reports. The German Netherlands Corps will add to the command structure that NATO has already created rather than replace it. The benefits are obvious. Responsibilities for organizing a response to Russian forces can now be divided between two corps, allowing NATO to collectively respond much quicker to a crisis in the Baltic region than it ever could before. Mass at speed is how one unnamed military official described it, and that's just what the Baltic states need if Russia's forces invade. All of this feeds into the overall strategy that NATO has created for the eastern flank. The Baltic Defense Line holds up Putin's forces. The The multinational Corps Northeast and the German-Netherlands Corps combines to arrange the ground-based response. The German-Netherlands Corps has plenty of experience too. Throughout the 2000s, it's been one of the most active arms of NATO. Deployments to Afghanistan in 2003, 2009 and 2013 mean that it has relatively recent warfighting experience, and the Corps has also served as a standby component of the Land Component Command of the NATO Response Force, which is a task it fulfilled in 2005, 8, 2015 and 2019. Whether it's dealing with humanitarian operations or organizing a rapid response in a warfighting scenario, the German-Netherlands Corps is exactly what Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia need to make the entire concept of the Baltic Defense Line work. Corps is also the exact opposite of what Putin wants to see in the Baltic region. Russia's leader has just learned that if you keep making threats, you're going to get a response. There's a major reason why the dragon is getting ready to clench its jaws, and NATO is sending another army corps to the eastern flank. The immediate and constant Russian threat to the Baltic states. The timing of all these Baltic and NATO moves is far from coincidental, particularly when it comes to Latvia. On May 19th, the Moscow Times revealed that Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service has claimed that Latvia is preparing to allow Ukraine to start launching drones from 5 military bases into Russian territory. Those bases, Russia claims, are Adazi, Silesia, Lielvārda, Daugavpils and Jēkabpils. Russia isn't happy about what it claims to have discovered. Latvia says that it's all a lie, but Russia claims that it has determined the locations of drone launch points in Latvia from coordinates of drone debris, and it started to threaten retaliatory strikes against any nation that it claims is helping Ukraine to send drones into Russian territory. A supposed special warning has been delivered to the Baltic states, Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu has claimed. As is so often the case, there is a measure of hypocrisy to what Russia is claiming. It was only in early May that a pair of drones crashed at an oil depot in Latvia, prompting the resignation of Latvia's entire cabinet, including Prime Minister Evika Salina and Defense Minister Andris Spruds, amidst infighting over who was to blame. Russia claimed that the drones were Ukrainian, but Putin would have been rubbing his hands with glee when seeing so much infighting. The point here is that tensions are high between Russia and Latvia. A powder keg seems to be on the verge of igniting. Those tensions are only rising as a result of other actions that Russia has taken, which place Latvia and the other Baltic nations under immediate threat. On May 25th, Politico reported that the Baltic states are turning to Ukraine to help them create bomb shelters that could protect citizens against Russian drones and missiles. That move was prompted by a drone violating Lithuanian airspace the week prior, which resulted in residents of the city of Vilnius being encouraged to seek shelter as the country's president and prime minister were rushed into bunkers. Russia is becoming bolder with its drones, and the Baltic states are increasingly worried that what are currently aerial incursions will evolve into a ground campaign. And they should be worried. Also in May, Putin put pen to paper on a new law that authorizes the use of Russian military forces to protect Russian citizens abroad. According to the Kyiv Independent, the new law sees Putin authorize himself to essentially declare war to protect any Russian citizen who faces arrest, trial, detention, or any other sort of supposed persecution by a foreign state. Let's call a spade here. Russia has basically given itself permission to invade any country under false pretenses. The Kyiv Independent says there are about 40,000 Russian citizens in Latvia and more than 80,000 in Estonia. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what Putin is doing here. He's basically telling the Baltic states that any punishment doled out to these citizens for crimes that they might commit is grounds for an invasion. It doesn't matter if the punishment is justified. Russia is watching and waiting for an excuse, and the new law means that Putin can give the go-ahead for a war whenever he feels like it. NATO is doing something massive on its eastern flank because May has been the month when Russia signaled that it's intending to push things too far. But for the Baltic states, this is a reality that has been developing for some time. Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia all know that they will be first in the firing line if Putin decides that he wants to extend the war in Ukraine into a war against NATO. When that war comes in 10 years, 5 years, or even in the coming months, the Baltic states have to do everything in their power to Putin-proof themselves. The rhetoric is being ramped up now, but the hybrid war has been going on for years. For example, Russian guards have been removing buoys in the Narva River that demarcate the border between Russia and Estonia since 2024. Russia is encroaching on the sovereignty of the Baltic states indirectly, and it seems to be gearing up to take a more direct approach in the near future. The Baltic states know that they're vulnerable. In April, Defense News reported that a study drafted by the Baltic Defense Initiative, which is a think tank based in Lithuania, suggested that Russia could overrun the Baltic states in just 90 days, especially if Russia follows the template of aerial bombardment created by the US in Iran during Operation Epic Fury. That doom and gloom scenario does make several interesting assumptions, including France withdrawing its nuclear umbrella from the Baltic states. Still, it's a worrying analysis and a wake-up call to the Baltic states and NATO. Something has to be done about the Putin problem. If Russia's leader succeeds in Ukraine, NATO's eastern flank may be next. NATO needs to wake up to this threat, and it needs to do it quickly. That's what we're seeing in Latvia right now with the deployment of Dragon's Teeth, and it's what we're seeing with NATO's decision to send the German Netherlands Corps to the Baltic region. Defences are being put in place. One of the most effective rapid response units that NATO has at its disposal is now heading to the Baltic. If Russia does attack, Putin won't have the easy ride that he thinks he'll have. The Baltic Defense Line stands ready, and it's going to keep getting stronger to ensure that nothing that Putin has planned will come to pass. Not that Putin is quite ready to start a war with NATO yet. He has plenty of problems with Ukraine to handle first, as well as a threat of his own to deal with in Russia's east. In the ultimate irony, Russia is losing ground in its east as it prepares to attack NATO's east, and that ground is being lost not to an enemy, but to a supposed ally. The Russian Far East covers 40% of the nation's territory, but the population is collapsing at an alarming rate. China is taking advantage, and you can find out how by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show so you don't miss any of our analysis of the latest developments in the Baltic theatre. And thank you for watching.